Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Commander Adventures. I hope you're having a nice holiday season so far, and thank you all for clicking through to this channel. As a quick heads up, with finals and the holiday season rapidly approaching, this is either going to be the last or the second to last gameplay video of the year. We're waiting to hear back about one recording session, and if it goes through, there'll be a video 2 weeks from now. Either way, we'll be back to our regular schedule on January 4th. But let's not waste any more time and jump into introductions. First off, we have George, testing out his new Ghired Conclvae Exile deck. It's a Tokens Matter build, which was built from the pieces of his Reese the Redeemed deck. We then have Chris, meddling with things alongside Ertai the Corrupted. This is a hard control deck, which runs a mix of enchantments, walkers, and spells to control the game while digging for a win. Next up is RJ, angrily looking for a win on the channel, alongside Omnath, Locus of Rage. This is the original landfall deck, which focuses on creating 5/5 elementals from Omnath, and then either overrunning with them, or sacrificing them to trigger Omnath's damage effects. Finally, we have Alex, vying for the throne, alongside Queen Marchesa, long may she reign. His deck focuses heavily on tokens and extort to slowly damage and drain his opponents out. George starts us off. He drops a Wooded Foothills and passes. Chris drops a tapped Arcane Sanctum. RJ drops a Dryad Arbor. George cracks his Windswept Heath as Alex drops a Temple of Triumph. Alex leaves the card he scries on top, and George brings in a tapped Stomping Ground. George untaps, and then drops a Clifftop Retreat. He casts a Farseek, and brings in a tapped Temple Garden. Chris untaps, and then drops an island. He then finishes up his turn by casting a Talisman of Hierarchy. RJ drops a Command Tower. He casts a Young Pyromancer before passing. Alex drops a Secluded Step, and remembers to untap before passing as well. George untaps. He drops a Grove of the Burn Willows, and taps out to cast a Perforos, God of the Forge. Chris drops an island, and then casts a Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. He upticks him, and mills a Swamp and a Supreme Verdict before drawing a card and passing to RJ. RJ casts a Tilinali Summoner. He misses a land drop, and passes. Alex drops a Swamp. He casts a Reassembling Skeleton, and passes as well. George untaps. He drops a Forest, and then casts his commander Ghired. Chris then untaps, as George finds his Rhino token from Ghired, and RJ reminds everyone of the 4 damage they should have taken from Perforos. Chris then casts an Orzhov Signet. He follows it up with an Ever-Watching Threshold. He then upticks Jace again, and mills Austere Command and Cyclonic Rift before drawing a card, and passing. RJ untaps. He drops his own Windswept Heath, and cracks it while losing a total of 3 life to shock in his own copy of Stomping Ground. As RJ offers cuts, George finds his pesky Rhino token. RJ then moves to combat, and swings the Summoner at Jace, and the Pyromancer at Chris. Ever-Watching Threshold triggers, and Chris draws a card. He then takes 2 damage, and Jace loses a loyalty counter. In his second main phase, RJ casts a Harvest Season. He brings in a Forest, and a Mountain tapped, and then passes. Alex untaps, and casts a Boros Signet. RJ then remembers his token from Young Pyromancer as Alex passes. George untaps. He then casts a Carpet of Flowers. He follows it up with an Anger, and everyone takes 2 from Perforos. George then moves to combat, and swings Ghired at Alex, and then the rest of his board at Jace. On attacks, Ever-Watching Threshold triggers, and gives Chris a draw, and George populates his Rhino token thanks to Ghired. The Rhino enters tapped and attacking RJ, and everyone ends up not blocking. Damage resolves through, and Jace dies. George then reminds everyone of the 2 damage from Perforos, before passing off to Chris. On his upkeep, Chris casts an Enlightened Tutor, and goes to grab a ghostly prison to the top of his library. He drops a silent clearing for turn, and then pings himself to cast the ghostly prison he tutored up, and finishes his turn by casting a Baleful Strix, drawing a card as it enters. RJ untaps, and drops a mountain for turn. He then casts a Fires of Yavimaya. He follows up with a Hull Breach to destroy George's Carpet of Flowers and Chris's Baleful Strix. He then remembers his elemental from Young Pyromancer. RJ moves to combat and swings out at George. George takes a total of 5 damage, and RJ passes off. Alex untaps. He then casts a Soul Ring. He follows up by casting his commander, Queen Marchesa, long may she reign. George untaps, and then Alex remembers his draw from the Monarch token. George then casts a Luminarch Ascension. He then moves to combat, and swings Ghired at RJ, and then Anger and a Rhino token at Alex. On attacks, he populates his Rhino token, and Perforos triggers. He then sends the attacking token at Alex. Alex blocks Anger with Marchesa, and then damage resolves through. As George becomes the Monarch, everyone remembers the 2 damage from Perforos, and Anger dies. George then passes to his end step, and draws from the Monarch token. Chris untaps. He drops a Swamp for turn, and then casts a Damnation. The board is wiped. And RJ finally remembers to ascend from Tilanali's Summoner, as Chris casts an As Foretold. Chris points out Dryad Arbor as he passes, and George gets a counter on Luminarch's Ascension. RJ untaps. He casts a Kadama's Reach, and goes to grab a mountain tapped, and a Forest to hand, which he plays for turn. He then casts a Croissant Grip to destroy George's Luminarch Ascension, before passing turn. Alex untaps. He drops a Plains, and then casts a Knight of Obligation. He follows it up with a Talismanic Conviction, and extorts the spell, causing each of his opponents to lose a life, and gaining life equal to the amount lost this way. He then passes off. George untaps. He then casts a Finale of Glory, where X is 3. He creates 3 2/2 soldiers with Vigilance, and each of his opponents takes 6 damage from Perforos as he finds his tokens. He draws from the Monarch at end step, and passes. Chris untaps, and As Foretold triggers on his upkeep. In his main one, he casts Serum Visions thanks to As Foretold, and draws a card before scrying 1 away. He then drops an island for turn. He follows it up by casting a Teferi Time Raveler. He upticks him, and his sorceries have flash until his next turn. He then finishes up by pinging himself to cast a Glenelendra Archmage. RJ untaps. In main 1, he casts his commander, Omnath, Locus of Rage. He drops a Forest, and creates a 5/5 elemental with haste. He then moves to combat, and swings out at George. George blocks with a pair of Knights, and RJ passes off. Alex untaps, and then miracles a Reforge the Soul. As everyone wheels, we'll be right back.
I'd say the first round goes to the Orc.
Magic the Gathering. Beat your friends.
Alex then drops a Rugged Prairie. He recasts Marchesa, long may she reign, and becomes the Monarch as she enters. He then remembers to pay to extort everyone. He draws an end step from the Monarch, as George untaps. George drops a Fortified Village, revealing a Plains as it enters. He then casts a Birds of Paradise, and everyone takes 2 from Perforos as it enters. He then follows up with a Mimic Vat. In response, Chris sacrifices Glenelender Archmage and counters Mimic Vat as she returns to the battlefield with a neg1 counter thanks to Persist. With nothing else to do this turn, George passes off. Chris untaps and adds a counter to As Foretold on his upkeep. He drops an island and then upticks to Teferi again. He then follows up by casting a Liliana of the Veil. He upticks her, and everyone discards a card. He then finishes up his turn by casting a Verity Circle. Before passing, RJ untaps. He casts an Azusa Lost but Seeking. After she resolves, RJ drops a handful of mountains and creates 3 more 5/5 elementals. He then casts a Perilous Forays. RJ pays to activate Forays twice, and bolts George's Bird and Soldier as the elementals die. He brings in a mountain and a forest tapped, and creates 2 more elementals from the landfall. He then moves to combat, and swings 25 damage at George. In main 2, RJ spends his last mana to activate Forays once more, bringing in a forest tapped, creating another elemental, and bolting Marchesa with the damage from the dead elemental before passing. Alex untaps. He recast Marchesa, long may she reign, and extorts everyone again. He then moves to combat, and swings 5 at George. He draws at end step from the Monarch token, and passes. George untaps. He drops a forest, and recast Ghired. Each of his opponents takes 4 damage from Perforos as he goes to grab his Rhino token. George then moves to combat, and swings out at Alex. He populates his Rhino on attack, and Alex blocks Ghired as everyone takes 2 from Perforos. The damage resolves, Alex takes 4, and George becomes the Monarch. He then draws at end step, and passes. Chris untaps, and puts a counter onto As Foretold during his upkeep. He drops a Plains, and then upticks Liliana, forcing everyone to discard. He then downticks Teferi, and bounces Perilous Forays back to RJ's hand, before drawing a card. He then freecasts Dovin Hand of Control, thanks to As Foretold. He downticks Dovin, and targets Omnath, and now Omnath can't deal damage to Chris until Chris's next turn. He then passes turn. RJ untaps. He then attempts to recast Perilous Forays. In response, Chris counters it with Glenelender Archmage. RJ then moves to cast an Overwhelming Stampede. Once again in response, Chris freecasts a Disallow thanks to As Foretold, and counters RJ's spell. RJ then moves to combat, and hits George with Azusa, and Alex with his elementals, all for lethal. RJ becomes the Monarch, as George and Alex are both eliminated. In main 2, RJ casts a Sylvan Library, before passing and drawing from the Monarch token. Before he does so, Chris uses Verity Circle to tap down RJ's Omnath. Chris untaps, and puts a counter onto As Foretold during his upkeep. Chris upticks Liliana, and then they both discard again. He then downticks Dovin, targeting Omnath, and kills Teferi to bounce an elemental token back to RJ's hand. He forgets to draw from Teferi, and then finishes up his turn by freecasting Island Sanctuary thanks to As Foretold. RJ untaps. He then activates Sylvan Library. He loses the game if he keeps more than 1 card, so he puts 2 back. He then drops a mountain, and creates an elemental thanks to Omnath. RJ then attempts to move to combat. As he does, Chris freecast Anguished Unmaking, targeting the fires of Yavimaya. In response, RJ sacrifices fires to pump Azusa until end of turn. Anguished Unmaking then loses target and fizzles. Still before combat, Chris then taps 2 elementals with Verity Circle and draws 2. RJ then swings Azusa and his remaining elemental at Chris for 8 damage, as Chris forgets to have him pay for Ghostly Prison. RJ then passes turn and draws from the Monarch token. Chris untaps. He puts a counter on to As Foretold on his upkeep, and then elects not to draw a card to turn on Island Sanctuary. Chris starts off by downticking Dovin, targeting Omnath. He then ultimates Liliana. He keeps his pile simple by making RJ choose between land and non-land permanents. And RJ chooses to keep his lands while sacrificing his non-land permanents. Chris then freecast Ashiok with As Foretold. He upticks Ashiok and exiles the top 3 cards of RJ's library. He hangs on to Ramanov Excavator for now, since he may be able to get it back in the future with Ashiok's second ability. Chris then closes out his turn by casting a Kefnet the Mindful. RJ draws for turn. He taps 6 mana and casts a Warstorm Surge. In response, Chris activates Kefnet to draw a card, and with no additional response to Warstorm, it resolves. RJ then taps out, with just enough mana to recast Omnath. He hits Chris with Warstorm Surge, and wins the game! Game review. This game really shows the importance of 1 point of damage. The last round only happened because Chris missed a damage trigger from Talisman in the early game. Fortunately though, RJ did still walk away with the win, it just took an extra turn. There's really not a whole lot to say here. Each deck did exactly what it wanted to do, and it all really came down to timing. George and Alex were both able to whittle everyone down with Perforos and Extort respectively, and Chris threw down enough control effects to keep himself alive, while keeping his opponents behind. RJ had a slow start, which ultimately kinda worked to his advantage. By the time everyone else at the table was beginning to run on fumes, he had plenty of cards in hand and presence on board to slowly eliminate everyone and walk away with his first win on the channel. I want to thank all the players for being a part of today's game, and to give a shout out to Dungeon Games for allowing us to film. If you're local and interested, I would strongly encourage you to come out on Saturdays, when Devin records these games, and he'll do his best to get you into a pod. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and a comment, and make sure to subscribe to see more of our Commander content. I don't play too much Magic anymore, but I promise to be on the channel when we hit 500 subs. Expect to see me in a game soon. And as always, thank you for watching. We're glad to have you here.